They called it superior conjunction, a sterile scientific term for the moment 3E Atlas disappeared behind the blinding disk of the sun. For the world, it was a pause. For astronomers, a blind spot. For those who felt the hum in their bones, it was the held breath before a plunge into the unknown. Official channels went quiet, broadcasting reassuring messages that observation was impossible and that we would see the comet again in a few weeks. They were lying. They couldn't see it in the optical spectrum, but they were desperately listening with other ears. The gravitational wave observatories, LIGO and Virgo, built to detect the collisions of black holes billions of light years away, suddenly began to register a local signal. It wasn't a sharp spike, but a quiet, rhythmic thump, a heartbeat. It was coming from behind the sun, from a point where nothing should be but the star itself and a tiny piece of ice. The mass of 3I Atlas was too minuscule to warp spacetime enough to be heard, but the detectors did not lie. Worse were the neutrino telescopes, giant tanks buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice which monitored the flow of neutrinos from the sun's core, began to show a deficit. Something behind the sun wasn't just blocking neutrinos, it was absorbing them. The stream of particles that had passed unhindered through any matter for billions of years had decreased by 3%. The number seemed insignificant, but physicists understood. To stop a neutrino, you need a density that does not exist in nature, or a technology we cannot imagine. And then, the sun itself began to run a fever. On the side facing Earth, the star was calm, but satellites monitoring its far side transmitted a picture of chaos. Coronal loops, magnetic arches the size of dozens of Earths, began to twitch and snap. Flares erupted not chaotically, but in a strange sequence. They were directed not outward but sideways, as if the sun were trying to push something unseen away, as if it were fighting off a predator. The most terrifying report came from helioseismologists, people who study the vibrations of the solar surface. They found that the gravitational influence from behind the sun was twice as strong as it should have been from 3 Atlas alone. The calculations didn't add up. The math was screaming that there, in the blind zone, was not one object, but two. The second was a gravitational ghost. It couldn't be seen. It didn't radiate, but it weighed. On Earth, the mystical resonance shifted to a new level. The hum became two-toned, dissonant. People began to dream not just of a black sun, but of two suns eating each other in a slow dance. Geomagnetic storms became permanent. They no longer depended on solar flares. Their peaks now coincided precisely with the moments when Earth, the sun, and the unseen point behind it aligned. And then, at the climax of the conjunction, it happened. A radio pulse struck from behind the sun, a single, powerful, perfectly structured burst. It was not like natural noise, it was a transmission, mathematically complex, containing prime numbers, the constant pi, and something that resembled a three-dimensional map. It lasted for 72 seconds. Military satellites detected it. Radio telescopes recorded it. Within an hour, all the data was classified, but it was too late. Dozens of independent operators around the world had heard it. The silence was over. The world froze in anticipation. Whatever emerged from behind the blinding solar disk, it would no longer be the same 3D Atlas that had disappeared there weeks ago. It would be something new, something that had passed through fire and been reborn, something that was now not alone. Part 2. The Binary Terror. The day 3E Atlas was scheduled to reappear became the longest in the history of modern science. Every telescope, from Hubble to tiny rooftop observatories, was aimed at a single point of the glaring sky. They waited. The first thing to appear was not the object, but its effect. The edge of the solar corona bent more sharply than expected. The light from distant stars passing nearby shimmered as if viewed through superheated air, and then, slowly, a light emerged from behind the edge of the solar disk. But it was not one light, it was two. 2 points. One was the familiar bright blue glint of 3E Atlas, shining even more intensely than before. The second was a barely perceptible dark, almost black speck next to it. It did not shine, it absorbed light. Telescopes saw it only as a hole in the background radiation. They moved together, not just side by side, but in a slow gravitational waltz. They were orbiting a common center of mass like a single horrifying celestial machine. The gravitational ghost now had a body. On Earth, the mystical chaos exploded. The two-toned hum became a deafening symphony of dissonance that drove people mad. Electronic systems worldwide began to fail, suffering from phase interference. GPS signals jumped between 2 points. Financial markets for fractions of a second showed two different stock prices simultaneously. It was as if two versions of reality were trying to overwrite each other. The dreams became even clearer. People saw two objects. One, a ship of light, pulling a tail of ionized metal. The second, its dark brother, a prison of darkness, pulling a wake of distorted space. And then, one astrophysicist working in an isolated observatory in the Chilean desert understood the true nature of the catastrophe. He fed the parameters of the two objects into a simulation, their masses, their trajectory, their strange resonance. And the computer produced a result that made his heart stop. The two objects were not just passing by. Their combined gravitational resonance was creating something that shouldn't exist, a stable anomaly. A third gravitational point in the system, a gravitational anchor that had hooked itself into the fabric of space-time within the solar system. They weren't going to hit us. Their plan was far more elegant and terrifying. They were going to move us. This gravitational anchor began to subtly but inexorably affect the orbits of the inner planets, at first by hundredths of a percent, then by tenths. The Earth began to deviate from its usual path. The catastrophe was not a fiery Armageddon, it was a cold, slow death. A change in orbit of a fraction of a percent meant a change in climate. Glaciers would begin to melt, or conversely, advance. The ocean level would change, the seasons would shift. In decades, Earth would become either a scorching desert like Venus or a frozen ball like Mars. We had become passengers on a planet whose route was being rewritten in real time, and there was no weapon against a change in the fundamental laws of physics. In the last clear images obtained by the Webb telescope, astronomers saw a final chilling detail. The surface of the dark twin was not smooth. It was covered with geometrically regular structures resembling cities that were growing and reconfiguring themselves. 30 Atlas was the engine and the beacon. Its dark brother was the passenger, or the cargo. The last transmission they managed to decipher from the radio pulse contained no words. It was just a set of coordinates and vectors, a construction manual, a terraforming plan. Only the object of the terraforming was not a planet, but the solar system itself. Humanity had finally received proof that it was not alone in the universe. But this knowledge came with the realization that for these star architects, we were no more than dust on a construction site. Dust that would soon be swept away to make room for a new, more perfect world. The Armageddon had begun, and it was quiet, majestic, and utterly inexorable. By the time the world accepted that 3 Atlas was no longer alone, it was already too late to pretend this was just another interesting comet. The twin system had emerged from behind the sun like a slow revelation. One blazing electric blue core wrapped in a furious coma, and one light-eating shadow locked beside it, both revolving around a point in empty space that nothing should have occupied. Telescopes saw it as an obscene violation of symmetry, a pair of mismatched eyes staring back at the inner planets. The press called it a binary comet. The people who understood the numbers knew better. They were looking at a machine. The first proof came from the orbits. For centuries, the motions of the inner planets had been the most precise clock humanity possessed. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, all ticking along on paths that could be predicted to fractions of a second. Then, quietly at first, those predictions began to drift. Mercury arrived at perihelion a heartbeat early. Mars lagged by a heartbeat and a half. At first, the discrepancies were buried under measurement error and model refinements, until a young dynamicist overlaid them on the ephemeris of 3 Atlas and its dark twin. The pattern snapped into focus like a slap. Every deviation lined up with the passages of the twin system through certain critical geometries, moments when its gravitational field, modulated by that impossible dance, intersected the natural resonances of the planets. It was like watching a child push a swing. Tiny, perfectly timed nudges that, given enough cycles, would send the seat arcing over the bar. On cosmic scales, the pushes were microscopic. On human scales, decades, centuries, they were lethal. Earth's orbit was not a line carved in stone. It was a balance point on a knife edge of competing pulls. Shift that balance by 0.5%, and the delicate equilibrium of climate collapsed. Models that had once worried about 0.5 degree of global warming now showed something far worse. In one branch of the simulation tree, winters lengthened year by year until oceans locked in ice, turning the temperate zones into shrieking deserts of wind and frozen dust. In another, summers ratcheted upward, monsoons failed, and wet bulb temperatures rose above what human flesh could survive in open air. The only constant in all the runs was that the old Earth, the one that had cradled cities and crops and myths, did not survive the century. And still, on the surface, life went on. The markets opened each morning. Traffic lights flicked from red to green. Streams and podcasts and ads blared as if nothing had changed. The catastrophe approaching was too large to see from the inside, like a curvature in space-time that only became visible when you zoomed out far enough. The few who did see it, for real, in the math, in the code, in the terrified silence after the last line of a simulation finished running, found themselves staring at a choice their education had never prepared them for. Do you tell 8 billion people that the sky itself is being rewritten? Or do you quietly start building arcs? The mystic side of the crisis, dismissed for months as background noise, surged into sharp, ugly relevance. The two-tone hum that had once been the domain of insomniacs and fringe forums now showed up in hard data. Seismographs designed to listen for the slow grinding of tectonic plates began to pick up a high-frequency modulation that had nothing to do with earthquakes. Magnetometers across the globe, from research stations to oil companies' survey trucks, reported the same beat, a rising and falling interference pattern that matched, with sickening precision, the orbital period of the 3 Ayers Atlas binary. It was as if the entire planet had become a drum, and something out there was slowly tightening the skin. People living under old fault lines, the Pacific Rim, the Himalayas, the Mediterranean basin started reporting a new kind of premonition. Not the ancestral fear of shaking ground, but a vertigo that hit even when the Earth stood still. A sense that down was no longer a fixed direction, but a suggestion. Birds flew in perfect circles until they collapsed. Whales deviated from their migrations to follow invisible tracks that traced, on later maps, the current gravitational node of the twin. The dark component of the pair became the main obsession. At first, astronomers tried to treat it like a very weird asteroid. No albedo, no emission lines, no heat signature to speak of. But as 3 Atlas shed more material near the sun, the shadow did not. No coma, no jets, no dust. It remained a hole, a silhouette cut into the background heavens. Radar pings simply vanished into it, as if the waves had fallen off the edge of the universe. When James Webb finally caught a glancing reflection in the mid-infrared, the spectrum nearly broke the pipeline. The surface was not rock, not ice, not metal as any human industry knew it. The reflection came back fragmented into narrow, repeating bands like the teeth of a gear. Each band corresponded to a different structured material, layered at precise depths. Composites that could not have formed in any natural furnace, arranged in lattices that maximized strength, heat dissipation, and, most chilling of all, field control. 3 Atlas blazed like a torch. The dark twin was a grip. Together, they were not visiting. They were installing something. Behind closed doors, a phrase that had once been dramatic clickbait turned into a technical term. Cometary Armageddon. Not a single body racing in on a collision course, but a staged intervention at the orbital level. Early speculation about a swarm, multiple dark companions trailing along the same hyperbolic path, returned with a vengeance. Updated analyses of old survey images, processed now not for light, but for absences, began to show faint statistical hints that 3I Atlas might be only the brightest member of a train stretching millions of kilometers behind it. Each link in that chain would be another chance to tug, another anchor, another knob to twist. As panic started to leak through the cracks of official calm, a few desperate proposals made it to the top of the stack. One group wanted to throw everything Earth had ever launched with engines at the problem. Fusion prototypes, decommissioned nukes, even the aging interplanetary probes limping around Mars and Jupiter. Strap improvised drives to asteroids, ram them into the dark twin, pray that a kinetic kill shot at a fraction of light speed might chip away at the machine. The counter-argument was brutally simple. You cannot punch something you do not understand, especially when every move you make broadcasts your capabilities to the builders. Another faction went the opposite way. If 3 House Atlas and its partner were instrumentation, sensors, not weapons, then the only survivable strategy might be to go dark. Shut down high-power transmitters, quiet the noisiest industries, make Earth, from a few dozen astronomical units away, look as boring as possible, just another wet rock, unremarkable, not worth a closer look. But the genie would not go back into the bottle. Radio, radar, lasers, the hot fog of cities at night. Humanity had been shouting into the void for a century. Whatever was following Thrice Atlas's flight path already knew where the shouting came from. In the middle of these debates, something happened that turned the argument academic. The binary performed its first obvious maneuver. Up to that point, every odd acceleration, every non-Keplerian twist could be blamed, however implausibly, on outgassing, solar tides, measurement error. Then, over the course of a single 12-hour window, the pair adjusted their mutual orbit without shedding so much as a gram of observable material. The center of mass shifted by a tiny amount, just enough to change the long-term intersection points of their resonance with Earth and Mars. It was the celestial equivalent of a finger nudging 2 dominoes a millimeter closer together at the start of the line. There was no thrust plume, no flash, no thermal spike. From the outside, nothing moved that should not have moved, but the math flipped from maybe natural to absolutely intentional in one iteration. The system wasn't just exerting force on the solar system, it was responding to it. The last layer of denial peeled off in hours. Religious movements fractalized, some proclaiming that Thrios Atlas was the long-awaited instrument of judgment, others insisting it was an anti-god to be resisted with rituals, fasting, or mass suicide. Conspiracy forums, already bloated from years of lesser panics, exploded into 1,000 speculative timelines. In cities, riots bloomed and died as swiftly as thunderstorms, fueled less by clear demands than by a free-floating animal sense that something fundamental had gone wrong with the sky. Through it all, the hum never stopped. If anything, it became more complex, branching into harmonics that some people could whistle back accurately without knowing why. Brain scans of sensitive individuals began to show a new, synchronized pattern. Spikes of coherent activity, linking regions that usually only talked during deep meditation or seizures. Language centers lit up without input. Visual cortices fired in the dark. When asked what they were experiencing, many of these people gave the same answer, in different words. It's trying to show me something, but my mind isn't built to hold it. The most terrifying possibility took shape in the silence between lab meetings, in the shared glances at plots that should not exist. What if the gravitational retuning of the solar system was not the end goal, but the preparation step? A way to bring every orbit, every field line, every magnetic sheath into compliance with a template older than the sun itself. In that template, perhaps, planets like Earth were not habitats, but reaction vessels, places where chemistry could be run under tightly controlled conditions, then either harvested or scrubbed clean when the experiment ended. 3D Atlas in that model was not an invader, it was the timer, as the pair receded from the immediate glare of the sun, heading outward on the leg of their trajectory that would take them through Jupiter's influence. The measurable tugs on Earth's path remained, subtle but cumulative. The simulations projected a narrow window in which the damage could still, maybe, be kept below extinction thresholds if drastic measures were taken. Geoengineering on a scale never attempted. Orbital mirrors, sacrificial injections of mass into other resonances to counter the imposed ones. Even the optimists admitted the odds were thin. The realists said the important question was no longer, how do we stop this? But, how do we live knowing our sky is programmable by someone else? In the end, the cosmos gave no speech, no ultimatum, no clear sign that humanity's reaction mattered at all. 3D Atlas and its dark twin shrank, from gaping omens to bright points to a single stubborn pixel in the deepest exposures. The hum faded below human hearing, detectable only in frozen data streams and the strange, synchronized dreams of a dwindling minority. But the numbers did not forget. Year by year, perihelia shifted. Seasons crept off their old schedules. tides arrived a little early, then a little late, as the moon and the sun negotiated with a third absent master. Future historians, if any survive to write, would likely draw a neat line on their charts and label it with a date. The day the gravitational graphs for the inner planets diverged from 2 centuries of prediction. The day the era of human assumption ended. We had wanted a sign that we were not alone. 30 Atlas brought it, wrapped in ice and fire and silence, and behind it, perfectly invisible against the black, something else kept coming, following the new lines carved into space-time, unhurried, confident, already accounting for a system in which one small blue world had finally realized it was no longer steering its own course. This continuation keeps the same dark, conspiratorial tone and binary comet setup you've been using for your earlier 3 Atlas scripts.